The thing that we need to understand with environmental issues is that the solutions fundamentally start with us. They start with us with stopping to litter and picking up plastic that's after us. It starts with the buy-in that we get from the public and the common man. It starts with giving people an active incentive to actually understand and buy into the issues that are going on. And at a point where we prove that we can give you even marginally more action, regardless of what that action is and where it is focused, then we simply win this debate. But first, before we get into that, we'd like to frame what exactly we're proposing. So what is the 9 planetary boundaries framework? The planetary boundaries framework was developed to identify the areas of the environment which humanity depends upon the most for survival. And it gives us what specific and unique things, it gives us the damage that humanity has done to this environment and the safe space in which we need to operate in order to continue to thrive as a population. But what specific unique identification does it give in regards to this? The first is on what these boundaries are. And we need to note that it gives really niche boundaries that aren't really accessible with every framework, such as the impact that sulfur pollution has on farmers and the agrarian societies, etc. But even secondly, it gives very effective active tracking on the progress on how far these boundaries have been exceeded and how much progress has been made in remedying the impact that humanity has had on it. And it is important, this is done by continuous reports by a team of 18 scientists, which the framework already has been updated a number of times, most notably an update in 2015, which led to a development in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and even secondly last year in 2022, where they added more depth to the water boundaries, as previously focused on green water, previously focused on only blue water, but now they added more nuanced information on how green water is important to the environment and why the protecting of its use is important. So how are we proposing that this framework would be used? It would be used as the basis of informing policies and general efforts aiming to address environmental issues. What does this look like? Firstly, it looks like using it in policy. It looks like using it in the UN Sustainable Development Goals that it has been, the Paris Agreement, or informing the EU's Commission report every year. But even secondly, what does this look like? It looks like it's used in activism. Leaders informing the actions with the information given by the 9 planetary boundaries framework. What does this look like? It looks like Greta Thunberg using this information to lead the Fridays for Future movement, with the narrative that as of 2018, there were only 30 years left to reverse the impact of the climate change boundary. But even thirdly, we support its use in the commercial world. And what does this look like? It looks like metrics such as the environmental, social, and guidance score to determine if companies should be invested into based on how much work they're actually doing to contribute to the healing of the environment. So what will you get from team proposition? The first thing is that we will argue it will inspire the most action towards climate change. And that alone is enough to win. Why is it enough? The first is the urgent nature of these issues. The issues of climate change are urgent and needs to be fixed because there is a boundary at which we can cross that is irreversible. But even secondly, any marginal effort is better than no effort. At a point where we have more buy-in and persuade actors who would otherwise do nothing to act, then we give a better case than the opposition. So, on to our first argument. The planetary boundaries framework is the most widely and possibly easily accessible framework by the general public. Why is this true? Firstly, we need to understand that information on the environment is generally inaccessible. What does this look like? This looks like really long reports in agreements like the Kyoto Protocol that the common man just simply won't have the incentive to read. And it also looks like keeping up with conferences like COP27 to get actual up-to-date information as to what the current issues are and what the current solutions being done to fix them are and what we need to do, etc., etc. Why is this problematic? It's problematic because the general public is unlikely to take such action to learn some things. But even if they somehow do manage to get the drive to read through the Kyoto Protocol and see the issues that exist, it's very rare that you'll find someone in the general public who will understand. But again, at the point where the 9 planetary boundaries framework provides really simple information that's accessible through like a diagram that the general public is able to like glance at and look at. Even leaders like Greta Thunberg are able to simplify that information and have more access to that direct and updated information within the 9 planetary boundaries framework. And another thing that it gives to the public is important. It gives the public a progress report and checkup into how far the boundaries have been exceeded and how far we've actually progressed in remedying the damage that we've done to it. Why is this important? Firstly, because the general public are key actors into the mobilization of climate change movement. Why is this true? It's because such action is what will motivate policymakers and what will motivate government to incite those policymakers to act. Why is this true? Firstly, understanding our world, global crises are competing for attention. In the context of the African continent, you have things such as hunger, you have things such as drought, you have things such as war, and all other political dynamics, which make it very difficult for any kind of movement to garner any kind of attention. Which means that at the point where an official is sitting in the office, seeing where they're going to contribute resources to, it's imperative for the public to care about an issue in order for them to act on it. Why is this true? It's because politicians wish to be re-elected, and because of that, we will actively act on the policies that the public care about, because they must stay and gain in power. It also acts as a check-in mechanism, because then these politicians are actively accountable to the countries to the people that they're trying to remedy issues. Why is this different than status quo? It's different because this only exists predominantly in Western countries where these issues have generally already been risen. But at the point where we're able to go to developing countries where people are generally less educated and generally less interested in such issues, and actually educate them that for farmers in Kenya, for example, there's something that's actively harming your crop yield that people in such countries are likely to buy it. And even secondly, why this is important, it's because it insists on a sense of urgency. But before I go on, I'll take that point.
Yeah, what is your mechanism for why those stakeholders that you talk about, like developing nation people who don't have food on the table, or for example, people who don't have interest in climate, read through these 9 boundaries that are really long in time?
The point is that on our world, we have the most likely impact of reaching them. Why is this true? Because at a point where someone is actively going to read it, it will take a lot of a shorter time than any alternative that you have. But even secondly, we said that the leaders of movements will primarily be the one reading this information and utilizing it to mobilize people to act and protest, etc. So now onto some impacts. The firstly is that we're more likely to get these issues to receive attention. Second is more accountability. And even thirdly, encourage individual action. Again, and I'll say, at a point where public leaders are able to get up on public platforms and say the information that they are more likely to digest through these planetary boundaries, like for example, Greta Thunberg, a 17-year-old person at the time, is unlikely to go through and understand all of this COP27 information and give that same information to the masses to incite them to act. At the point where we're able to encourage individual action and notify individual people of the issues that they face, then we gain more impact. But even secondly, the use of this framework is principally justified. Firstly, because people have a right to know why the damage is happening to the world. But even secondly, they need knowledge of those issues to understand the rights that they have when it comes to protecting the environment and actually enforcing it to mobilize the governments to act. At the point where we prove one, why we give the best kind of accessibility to garner the public to act, but even secondly, create the most impact, then we simply win this debate. I hope you're proud of it.
We thank Prime Minister for a very kind speech. Now let's move on to first off, starting opposition's case. Here.
Hidden beneath the lights of science, an objective metric, lies a framework that is not nuanced to what is actually necessary for the environment and vulnerable actors. On side opposition, we prevent the loss of human life at the hands of metrics that do not account for the significant impact of environmental policies solely based on environmental metrics. On opposition, we forward two main arguments from first speaker. First is on the decrease in public support for environmental policies, and the second on how the boundary significantly hinders development. Before argumentation, there's three main pieces on frame I'd like to cover. First, on what exactly the 9 planetary boundaries looks like, and there's three characterizations I want to make note of. First, the planetary boundaries, or NPBs, present an extreme and radical step to climate change policies. That is to say, that insofar as it is made around the idea of making Earth inhabitable for years and years to come, it makes the boundaries extremely radical and restrictive. Second, it presents an unrealistic and therefore dystopian representation of humanity. And third, it portrays the requirements of fixing the environment to be large-scale global change. The second piece on frame I'd like to make note of is what the use of 9 planetary boundaries looks like, and there's two characterizations here. First, it looks like it being used in policy discussions in local governments or climate summits. But secondly, it also looks like the 9 planetary boundaries being used within the context of social movements and narratives. The third and final piece on frame is on what the world we support looks like. And basically, it's very simple. We imagine and envision the environmental advocacy and policies to look like what it is in the status quo and its likely trajectory of the current situation. Before argument one, extraneous rebuttals. Two things. Firstly, just because something is accessible and easy doesn't mean I read something. So the entire argument on how individuals, specifically in developing nations, are going to have increased exposure to information doesn't make sense. Just because I can watch anime doesn't mean I actively watch anime. They need to mechanize. But also, secondly, the right to information is perfectly protected in the status quo in developing nations, insofar as access to the internet still exists and censorship is not a thing. With that said then, the first argument I'd like to bring is on decreased public support for environmental causes. The first question under this argument is on why these citizens will be polarized from environments in the long term. And there's 4 reasons why this is true. Firstly, citizens will fail to understand the NPBs due to its complex use of numbers. The inherent nature of numbers is that you're unable to derive specific illustration or emotional connections. The second reason that it does not align, the second reason is that it does not align with their proximate surroundings and thus isn't convincing. The notion that the world is ending is inherently contradictory with our daily lives and sounds like a lie. Thirdly, when the NPBs are implemented in harsh ways, citizens on the ground now actually feel angry at environmental policies because these policies actively steal your livelihood. And fourthly, because these NPBs are so big in scale, it makes the impact of a citizen's day-to-day action look small and meaningless. So then the second main question under this argument is on what the implication of feeling this sort of alienation is. And there's 2 things here. First, people are far less likely to take individual actions that benefit the environment, which they characterize as essential. Even if it's small actions like recycling, on a global scale, it creates significant benefits. But second, environmental politicians likely lose support because the policies themselves get unpopular. This means that it increases the possibility of policies being reversed after the term of the current government's ending, and therefore even in proposition's very best case scenario, their policies on their side are not sustainable. The third question under this argument is on why it's unlikely to happen in our comparative. And this is because the kind of advocacy that we get on our side is far more likely to be convincing. This looks like a more humanized, emotional portrayal, or a more optimistic narrative that talks about how even small actions means you're contributing to environmental betterment. This advocacy is far more likely to be convincing to the average individual, and thus we are able to sustain political support for climate protection. Before moving to second,
what alternative do you give that would be even more effective in creating this people-pleasing idea of an environmental solution?
As I said in my frame, the alternative that we support is the extension upon the status quo and the likely trajectory that the climate change action and social movements take in the future. On to our second argument on how NPBs hinders development. The first question under this argument is on why it's likely that NPBs will be implemented in the form of harsh policies, and there's 3 reasons to say here. First, because for the government bench to accrue any of the benefits that they claim, they have to push for a world with a strong usage and employment of these standards. But secondly, even if you don't take that analysis, it's likely that the boundaries are forced upon these countries through international institutions because there exists no incentive for countries to opt in. And therefore, the only scenario in which countries opt into these environmental frameworks is when a higher power coerces them to do so. The third reason why implementation is likely to be harsh is that even if the boundaries aren't implemented by international institutions, the nature of these boundaries in and of itself suggests that new policies will be harsh. This is because the success of these environmental policies are now going to be measured by how effective they were in preventing us from crossing the boundaries, which are inherently absolute and threatening boundaries that are extremely hard to meet. With that said then, the second question under this argument is on how development is likely to be hindered through these harsh policies. And there's three things of note here. First, these developing nations are bound to coercive treaties. This looks like when a country shows a lack of compliance, that country receives pressure to comply through an imposition of sanctions, a decrease in international political support, etc. But secondly, developmental aid is now also contingent on how much emissions you reduce or how green you are. This forces countries to implement policies even when they're directly oppositional to their economic interests. And third, developmental policies and environmental policies tend to be in direct opposition. This looks like policies that limit development, such as an introduction of carbon taxation, strict limits on farmable land, and factory regulations. Before I move to impacts, sure.
Are you aware that all of the impacts that you're giving aren't inherently issues of the 9 planetary boundaries framework, but just the reality of how drastic the climate change issue is?
The impacts that we are giving is the implication that comes from the 9 planetary boundaries being inherently very, very harsh, significantly disproportionately impacting individuals and countries and developing countries, which creates this sort of situation, and I'll explain why this is significantly bad. What is the economic implication for people on the ground from our second argument? There's two things. The first is a commodity price increase due to A, there is a direct increase in the cost of energy due to it having to be climate and sustainable, but also B, being environmentally friendly with energy costs. Being environmentally friendly with energy costs money, like having to buy expensive filtration systems. The second implication is on an increase in unemployment, and this is due to companies lacking fundamental capital to employ people as they are being financially constrained when they have to use money for the environment. The comparative on our side is that in the absence of an absolute metric, we are far more likely to achieve balanced policies with a wider consideration for various effects. Note here that we are completely fine in our very worst case scenario to have no individual in developing countries have any knowledge on the environment, insofar as we drastically improve the lives of these individuals in developing countries and saves their lives. The NPBs ignore significant and important metrics for a thriving human race. Very proud to oppose. Thank you.
We thank leader opposition for a fine speech. Now let's move on to second part. Yes.
While the system offered or the solutions offered by team opposition seem to be a mitigation to the fact that the 9 planetary boundaries are a realistic framework and are highlighting very key and important topics within the issue of the environment that are not highlighted under status quo. And what is more important is that ignoring these issues has a harsh and dire consequence on the world as a whole. As the second speaker, I will get into how developing countries positively benefit from the 9 planetary boundaries, how businesses and private interests are more likely to be a part or are more likely to engage with the 9 planetary boundaries in terms of changing of behavior, and lastly, I'll go into the rebuttals of for their case. So the first thing I'll go into is the positive impacts of the developing world on the developing world. And in this case, it is crucial to understand that with this framework, we allow the world to know that we are connected and interconnected in the issues that are facing our climate. And this is important due to the fact that what changes or what effects have on one boundary affect another boundary. So what does this mean? This means that this highlights, and the impact of this has is that this would allow for developing countries to better negotiate with the developed world in terms of solving many of these issues due to the fact that it has a real impact on the developed world in this case. And the impacts of failure in this case on the developing world are great, or on the developed world are much greater due to the fact that migration from climate instability or instability in governance is highlighted when we have the issues stated of the climate, or when we have climate issues in this case. The issue of people migrating from the global south or to the global north, that is a concern. Or the issue of having to, many of the problems that will be faced by the global north, by the global south, being forced, in terms of displacement in this case, would be much greater on their side than on our side due to the fact that we have the information, number one, and number two, it's much more pressing, and this allows for a positive impact on the developing world. And moreover, when you talk about the investments into the developing world relating to these climate issues, that number one affects them, but number two also affect the other climate issues would increase due to the fact that there's now a method or there's a way in which we can now look at the developing world and the impacts that it has on the developed world as well. There's more buy-in in our world for solving the issues of the developed world, of the developing world from the developed world. And then the issue of global cooperation, extending beyond that, is the issue of global cooperation in terms of climate issues amongst much larger countries. And in this case, this looks like efforts between countries like China and the USA increasing due to the fact that they understand the issues that affect one country affect the other country, which further goes into the point of global cooperation beyond the issue of the developing world, but moving on to the developed world being more willing to cooperate with one another. And in the absolute least likely case, the principle of people understanding and having accessibility to this information is extremely important. As we understand, knowledge is power. And in this case, we're not trying to say that we're going to refuse, as the first speaker mentioned, would be less likely, would not want to have this the developing world coming into this, the developing world having an understanding of these issues. That not only decreases the buy-in that the developing world has for these issues, but it also decreases the ability for the developing world to understand the key issues that they're facing within their economies and understand the reasons as to why or how they can address many of these issues, rather than looking at the kumbaya world that they're presenting. Before I go into weighing of short-term goals versus long-term sustainability, I'll take that POI.
Yeah. Okay, so you say that the developed world will be more willing to cooperate, but what is exactly the mechanism for them leaving behind their prior incentives to survive on such and going to actively help the developing world?
From using the framework, we understand that one issue of the framework affects another issue of the framework. So this means that not addressing one issue of the framework that may be seen in one part of the world directly affects how they address another framework that is seen in their world, or in this case, in the developed world. So what this means is that it allows for many of these developing countries to better get funding that is able to address many of these issues and solve multiple climate issues with one solution. And moreover, I'll go into the short-term versus long-term sustainability. On our side, we view the trade-off of short-term sustainability or short-term economic growth to be less important than the long-term sustainability and the long-term goals that we see on our side. When you have a more cooperative world in terms of the addressing of climate change, when you have a world where people understand the key issues that are being presented, and as my first speaker talked about, they understand the manner in which they can address these issues, or there's an urgency to address these issues, we view the short-term trade-offs to be not as important, because we're talking about things that are life-altering, and we're talking about things that have an impact on a global scale. So in this case, this comes across like the issues that are created generationally. This affects your children, the children of your children. And in this case, we cannot sacrifice short-term sustainability or short-term economic growth in the case where long-term benefits are seen in our world. Before I go into the business interests and private interests, I'll take that point.
Yeah, not getting development and being entrenched in further poverty means that generations of your children are going to be impacted.
Exactly. When you do not provide people an understanding of how they can address many of these climate issues, or you do not provide people an understanding of how you don't provide people an understanding of the limits with which they operate within, that issue becomes more exacerbated due to the fact that, number one, as I spoke about, they don't have an understanding of where they are. So imagine we talk about land degradation. People are degrading the land, but they do not have an understanding of that how going into place. What happens to their children or the children of their children? Again, that is something that is not only symmetric, but I feel that's something that we win on in terms of the long-term sustainability, in this case, against the short-term trade-offs. Now, going into business and private interests within this debate, the business interests and the metrics that we provide have stemmed from the 9 planetary boundaries. Metrics like the ESG score, environmental, social, and governance score, allows for these companies, which have been influenced by the 9 planetary boundaries, allows for many of these companies to take more action that would be addressed by, take more action that is seen within the 9 planetary boundaries. What does this look like? This looks like companies either investing into renewable energy or renewable energy sources because of the fact that that's something that's been highlighted, or investing into issues relating to self-release, the fact that they understand that this is an issue highlighted by the 9 planetary boundaries, and it's also very visible as a metric to the shareholders that are within this company, and also to many of the shareholders and the public as well, because the public can now understand quantifiably the manner in which these companies are contributing to the success of the planet or the development of the planet. This secures investment for the future of many of these companies and provides direct incentives for many of these corporations to act through the metrics that are provided from ESG scores, which have been held through the 9 planetary boundaries. And moreover, companies using the model, or companies would, let's talk about the fact that companies may use the model to exploit the natural environment. Even if this is something that happens on our side, we know the impact that they're having on the natural world, and we can further or better address it in terms of a policy level, when we're talking about these issues. Having the framework that they provide when they talk about simply approaching things from a humanist point of view, how would that function when we're talking about the issues that companies are contributing to? That is something that is key to this debate, and I hope that they're able to address in this debate. We believe we've won on all of these points. Proud to propose.
The second half, continued case on the opposition side. Failure.
790 million individuals live under the poverty line today. 790 million individuals tell us that they lack access to basic necessities like food, let alone successful industries. These are desperate issues that cannot wait. This debate is not about whether or not knowing about the 9 Tier 2 boundaries is good or not, but this is about real-life implementation of this 9 Tier 2 boundaries. And real life is where I challenge Team Kenya to debate in. I'm going to do 2 things in my speech. First, I'm going to talk about development, and second, I'm going to talk about the environment. Before that, I just want to clarify what 9 Tier 2 boundaries actually looks like. Because the main contention that comes from Team Kenya, and the contention that their entire case is hinged on, is that 9 Tier 2 boundaries is very realistic, and it's very scientific, and it's very objective. No, I'm going to contest this at base. This is due to 2 reasons. A, the 9 Tier 2 boundaries was made by scientists whose main incentive is to make field gains within that field. Therefore, it was made with utmost priority towards the environment without considering other things like development. But secondly, it fails to consider the humans' capacity to actually survive and adapt to the environment. What does this look like? This looks like humans being able to do things like green technology. This looks like them being able to build things like defensive architecture. This looks like them simply being able to genetically evolve. Therefore, even if their calculus is they're willing to trade off the short term for the long term, it's likely that this mitigation applies in the long term, therefore taking down their weight. This is an important clarification because their entire case is, if the 9 Tier 3 boundaries is good, then the implementation will actually also be good. We cut the premise of this, therefore they cannot win. Firstly, let's talk about development. Why is this claim exclusive to our side and is therefore ground winning? Firstly, by the nature of the 9 Tier 3 boundaries, there's no regard for other things. This means this is an absolute metric. An absolute metric is zero sum because that is the metric by all international institutions and all governments now must abide by. But secondly, let's talk about the entry cost here. Development has a very high startup cost. This is because you actually have to invest in things that are very big in terms of infrastructure for them to actually be shared by the public. In comparison to that, as Kenya concedes, environment can be solved by things like solving the collective action problem and changing the mindsets of individuals on the ground. Therefore, it's likely to be only exclusive under our side, but other aspects like humanitarian development is actually considered. What is our claim here? Our claim here is that these standards are going to be pushed onto developing countries, and the mechanism for this is that developed countries do not necessarily want to see a net loss to them, but they abide by their environment, but other countries do not. Also, in order for the proposition to gain their like most benefits, where the boundaries aren't crossed, it's likely that this implementation has to be very harsh. They talked about 3 things here. Number 1, they said that you're able to actually get aid through the form of environmental aid. Number 1, this is not true. This is because when you give environmental aid, there's actually no benefit for the developed country insofar as environmental aid is unlikely to lead to things like trade and you being able to invest in new companies. In comparison, when you give development aid, the country financially develops, which is why you're able to establish things like trade relations, which is actually beneficial to you. But secondly, even if you're able to put environmental aid, insofar as that aid itself is contingent on fixing the environment, like what is the point? Because as they concede, developing countries are not major polluters. Even if they get this aid, it's unlikely to be as effective as they want to claim. Their claim was disingenuous. Secondly, they said that citizens on the ground can now gain knowledge, and now they're suddenly able to fix the environment. Firstly, what is the incentive for people who are starving on the ground to look at the 9 planetary boundaries? I think the more proximate incentive for them is to actually secure things like food. It's unclear what the incentive actually was. But secondly, even if these people are aware, it's unlikely what incentive or capacity they have to actually fix this problem that they're talking about. Thirdly, they said that corporate-like investment is likely to happen. No, this will not happen, because the reason why people invest into things like corporations is not because they want an absolute framework, it's because they want financial profit. Insofar as doing things that are environmentally unfriendly is likely to garner more profit, it's unlikely that people are going to invest under their side. I want to weigh this cash then. The weighing that I'm going to give here is on the quality of life of citizens on the ground. The value judgment I'm going to insert here is that environment only matters to the extent that it has an impact on the quality of life of people on the ground. First, if we can prove that the quality of life of people on the ground is higher on our side, we can also take the debate. With that, there's 2 pieces of framing. Firstly, on the intensity of impact, because let's be clear here, empirically speaking, 6 out of 9 of the boundaries are already crossed, right? And we're doing like pretty fine. But in comparison, people who do not have development are literally starving on the ground right now. And secondly, on time frame, when development happens, that is when you actually have the financial capacity to care about the environment, as shown by companies in America actually doing things like green technology. Outside of that value judgment, though, here's 2 pieces of weighing to show why our catch is the most important. Firstly, on principle, it is morally wrong that developing countries are hindered from developing because the harms of the environment stem from these developed countries emitting from their own process of industrialization. First, principally, these countries deserve the right. But secondly, as a prerequisite, right, you actually need to be alive in order to reap the benefits of the environment in the first place. I want to talk about the second clash then on environment. Before that, I'll take a POI there as well.
As your principal argument talked about many of these developing countries are shouldn't take the benefit, from funding. But under your word, wouldn't they take the major impact of climate issues? Doesn't that negate the issue of them consenting to these climate agreements?
No, I don't think that's true, because on our side, these countries are able to develop, which is why they're able to do things like defensive architecture and actively combat the environmental crisis that you want to talk about. Okay, on to the second question. On the environment. Firstly, I want to talk about the characterization of the implementation of these policies in the first place. First, as we already characterized, these are likely to be very harsh, and secondly, this only considers the environment. The implication of this characterization is very important. This is because the exposure that people have towards these 9 planetary boundaries is not through reading the impact, but because of their own analysis on how people are interested in development, but the exposure that they have to the 9 planetary boundaries is through the policies that these governments have. Therefore, because these policies are likely to be harsh, people feel active alienation and hatred for the environmental policies in the first place. Therefore, because of the way of exposure, it's unlikely that people's perception is going to change. I want to flip this then. Awareness is actually better on our side. The reason because movements campaign people on our side in order to get policy change to lobby the government. But on their side, because the government is already implementing these policies, social movements aren't actually going to push their environmental agenda onto these people. Therefore, social movements have less incentive to spread awareness on their side. I want to engage the specific impacts that they have here. They say that when people are aware, they're able to solve the collective action crisis. This is a huge logical leap, right? Because even if people know, it's unlikely that they're actually going to take steps insofar as this is not a proximate incentive for them. What is the strategic implication under this cash? Proposition cannot win on that big push. Firstly, because baseline environmental protection is absolutely symmetric. The reason for this is that humans' gut instinct is obviously to survive, right? Which means that they're obviously going to do the baseline steps in order for them to protect themselves against the environment. But secondly, if their biggest push is the collective action problem, that is better solved on our side because of our analysis on things like people feeling alienation and people thinking that the boundaries is too much, that all of their actions are minimal. At the end of the day, it's abundantly clear that their environment comes at the cost of development. Very proud to propose.
Panel, what we have to understand in this debate, and crucially to understand how exactly our world looks compared to theirs, is the fact that much like other frameworks, when this framework is being used, right, it's being used in tangent with other scientific theories, other ideas, other frameworks, but also most importantly is the fact that it's already being used in status quo. So when I tell you in first speech the idea that we are here to defend status quo, they're essentially conceding to our side. Why? Because they've given you multiple examples of how this framework is already used in status quo. What we are arguing for is the further support or the increased support of this. What does their world actually look like? Their world looks like a world where these boundaries are completely not being supported. So they had to come and give us reasons why, and that give us justification why this isn't being supported. But even secondly, they cannot come and claim that they are supporting status quo in that these boundaries are already being used in status quo, and we've shown you how, for example, in the SDGs, in the draft 0 of the Paris Agreement, etc., etc. Secondly, panel, what you have to understand is that the entire case is based on the fact that these boundaries are then too harsh, and this will lead to a whole bunch of harms, which they don't tell us how, one, this is exclusive to their side of the world. Panel, why is this important? Because if we're looking at climate action, if we're looking at boundaries or agreements on climate, they inherently have to be harsh, and I'll prove to you that in my speech and why that harshness is important. But even secondly, panel, and a really crucial and important response to this is that it doesn't engage with how they've been used in status quo. And these are the examples that we brought to you in first speech, for example, the SDGs, the Paris Agreement, and the Fridays for Future. These are already existing ways in which and implementations of this framework, which have not been harsh to the point where the buying is completely erased and there's no incentive to get involved in these movements. But secondly, the drastic issues are a reflection of reality, and I'll prove to you why this reflection of reality and why we need to face the facts is important in this debate, especially for considering urgency in the climate issue. So I think then two main clashes as I see them as they pan out in this debate. Firstly is on the issue of which side is better able to gain sustainable development, and secondly is on the issue of buying and how many actors were actually able to get in and have effective climate action. Beginning with the second clash on the issue of buying, we've proven to you on 3 levels how we're able to get buy-in: on the government level, on the leaders level, but even on the local level of your everyday person. Why is this buy-in effectively important, right? Because they give us a response, right, which is that the harshness of these boundaries would reduce the buy-in. The mechanisms they give you for this and why they're fundamentally flawed and why we think our buy-in still stands is that first, the issue of the planetary boundaries being, or numbers that are complicated or being hard to quantify, we think isn't an exclusive harm on our side of the world. Because if we're looking at the alternatives that they present with the Kyoto Protocol and with all of these other alternatives that are equally as hard to digest, then it becomes a symmetrical issue. What we then provide to you exclusively is the interconnectivity of these boundaries, the fact that they are able to touch on multiple environmental areas. But even thirdly, if we ignore all of that, the fact that what they've claimed is simply untrue in this debate. Why is this? Because we see in status quo ways to digest the 9 planetary boundaries that are easy. You see a graph and it's showing you where we've passed and where the safe zone is. We think at a point where it's easily able and it's easily digestible that we're able to get this fine. If I continue, I'll take it.
Sure. If citizens look at the graph and the boundary is already crossed, what is the incentive for them to actually do action that helps the environment?
I'll get into that and prove that and why we have that better on our side of the world and prove that in my speech. So again, then going on to what they're mentioning, right? They give us one response as to why this accountability and why this buy-in doesn't exist on our side of the world, which is the fact that just because we look at these boundaries doesn't mean we then have the incentive to then act on them. 2 responses, right? The fact that people have these boundaries and have these accessibilities, we think is important, even if it leads to marginal action. We think it's important and we think it's a principal right for people to have access to this information. But even secondly, we've proven to you, we've shown to you how the leaders of movements such as Fridays for Future are then the ones who are then able to get this movement from the citizens, right? The leaders will actively know and then inform, of the icons of the political leaders around, will then be able to form and inform these people of what, inform their followers, and then we're able to get the action that we are looking for. So in terms of weighing panel, we think that the metric for buying on their side of the wall simply does not exist, or simply... I'll take it in a second. The metric for buying on their wall simply does not exist because they do not provide to us any substantive alternatives as to how they're able to get buying on their side of the wall. But panel, even secondly, the reason why we gave you a stakeholder analysis of the businesses, of the citizens and of the government is because the nature of these climate agreements means that we have to get everybody involved, and because of this utilitarian aspect that it affects everyone, thus everybody would need to be involved. I'll take your PY.
What's your analysis as to why social movements about the environment can only uniquely exist in your world and therefore lobby politicians in your world?
I don't think that's a claim we've made on our side of the world. The claim is that they're not going to exist but be more accessible, right? If we're looking at status quo at the moment, these things exist, the Kyoto Protocol exists, the Paris Agreement exists, but if you go to your average citizen and go to your average person, let's say in a developing country, they're unable to quantify action that they need to take. Something we get from their side of the world, right, is the fact that political support will reduce and thus there'll be less buying. And they tell us this because it's a global issue that a citizen or myself would look small compared to the boundaries that we're trying to combat. Again, panel, we think this is a symmetrical issue. If we're looking at that side of the world with the Paris agreements, right, we're looking to reduce global warming by 5% or the temperatures by 5%. We think, again, that's again a global target. We think the issue of looking small becomes symmetric. What we provide to you exclusively on our side of the world is the interconnectivity of these boundaries, which we think is then valuable in this debate. On to the second clash, which is on the issue of sustainable development. Panel, again, going back to these harsh policies and why they then, even if we take them at our absolute worst case, why these harsh policies then become important. One, they give us a very harmful response to their case, which is the fact that these policies being harsh then hinders development and is unfair on the developing countries. Panel, one important thing to note about this is the fact that climate change policies is in and of themselves, if they use that metric of being unharsh, we think then it doesn't become exclusive to the 9 planetary boundaries, it becomes an exclusive issue. But even secondly, the idea of hindering development, we think, doesn't hold as much water in this debate because of two main reasons. One, in the planetary boundaries, there's an exclusive benefit there's an exclusive incentive for developing countries to then aid in development of green tech and of green solutions because it directly affects them in developing countries, meaning that we as the USA would then be incentivized to develop and to help other nations develop these green tech solutions because I know it will come back and affect me in another area of the planetary boundaries. Because of this, we're likely to have more green tech innovation. We're likely to have more of this, and we think that's important when we're in this debate for two main reasons. One is because even if we're trading off development in the short run, we think it's more important because of gaining sustainability in the long run, and we think that's important because of the issue of urgency in this debate. But even thirdly, panel, if they say that we're hindering the development of our future generations and the quality of life of future generations, we think at a point where you've developed your country now, but in the future you're suffering from excessive climate change effects, then your future generations suffer more and there's more harm therefore on that side. Because of this, we're proud to oppose.
With hand upward for reference, now is moving on to output to summarize from the perspective of the opposition side.
Can I be heard if I talk at this volume? Okay. Let's talk about the counterfactual first. We told you all the way from first, consistently, that the counterfactual that we support on our side is merely an extension of the status quo. We have every fiat to assume this, because without the existence of aggressive use of non-planetary boundaries, it's very likely that it will be the continuous use of the status quo, where non-planetary boundaries isn't getting that much often. So what is the status quo actually like? And let me characterize this, because it's very important for their case and detrimental. They assume that non-planetary boundaries is already being used in the status quo. But no, that's not exactly the case, right? Non-planetary boundaries purely focus on cutting down on emission and purely focus on the scientific aspects of how much reduction you're able to do and how much protection you're able to get for things like environmental policies. You don't see any of that being reflected in things like SDGs, where they actually care about developing people on the ground, giving access to things like gender equality and such. Therefore, all of these empiric analysis actually proves their point otherwise, and therefore their weird framing that comes from their prop theory is just a little bit false. With that, I want to engage on two topics. Firstly, does development happen on their side of the house, and why this actually warrants the debate? Secondly, on the environment, will people buy in or buy out of the environmental movements? Firstly then, on development. And we think this is the far most important issue that they fail to engage to. And actually, the strategic mistake that I want to highlight at the top of this speech is that they concede to all of this analysis. They argue, precisely down all of their bench, that they support things like stricter policies and harsher implementations of environmentally protective measures. And therefore, as they do not engage at all to the fact that we already proved to you that these stricter measures are likely to lead to reduction in things like development, they concede that development will happen. And here's why this was strategic a mistake for them. This is because we've given you countless weighing metrics as to why development is the most important thing. They say long-term, but we already told you why development is likely to have a long-term impact on these citizens on the ground. They say things like these developing nations will be impacted by things like the environment. But we also told you that environment is a global impact, right? Regardless of whether developing nations get these economic benefits or like strive for environmental change, it's very likely that environmental change will happen. Because precisely as they argue in Prop 2, environmental change as of the status quo, and a lot of emissions done in the status quo, are done by big nations such as China and the US, which are already developed. Therefore, as the extent of the change that these developing nations can bring is extremely marginal, we think what's more important is their economic capacity to fight back against it. Therefore, we support the use of developing their nations. Yeah, sure.
Are you aware that climate change issues also extend to things like extended drought seasons, which very materially harm people as they give people less access to food?
Yeah, I think so, but I think that exists symmetrically on either side of the house. What can actually benefit these people's economic return is by actually giving them the ability to develop themselves in their infrastructure, that they get tangible benefits. These impacts are likely to manifest on either side of the house. It's just symmetric. With that said, I'm going to talk about what they actually concede to with their analysis more in detail. Because let's talk about what the world with the 9 planetary looks like that Kenya illustrates for us. They illustrate 3 of the following. Firstly, they say that funding by the MNCs and the government is going to be contingent on environmental protection. Secondly, they argue that 9 planetary boundaries being implemented is going to be implemented by most governments on the ground. And then thirdly, Prop 3 actually comes up here and argues that they uniquely support the aggressive use of these things. All of this concedes the fact that there's going to be stricter regulations on development for developing nations. What does this do in the debate? I have a couple of things I want to prove to you here. Firstly, development is actually prerequisite on foreign investment, which means that actually they have no capacity to get development on their side of the house. So their side blankly just shakes off this argument on development by saying that it's not important, but their side neglects the fact that their side not only is not able to get further development, but actually stops development on the ground. We already told you that startup cost is extremely high for development, and that is why for them to actually get infrastructural development, they need to actually have a lot of money. That's why government and MNC's funding is extremely important. Therefore, our argument was that development doesn't happen on their side, crucially unengaged from their side of the house. The second implication of this that we already told you from first is that development, in order for you to actually have development, you need actual policies that emit to some degree like carbon emission, right? And their heavily reductionist policy actually cuts down on that. All of these actually prove to you that development is a positive benefit that we can uniquely get on their side and they cannot get on their side of the house. Their minor engagement to all of our analysis is to say that developing economy will be better because, of the POI thing that they already talked about. But I have 2 responses to this. Firstly, there's no explanation as to why this won't happen on our side of the house. People's economic knowledge of what the environmental destruction does will happen symmetrically on either side, given that they already concede to the fact that things like social movements are likely to exist. But secondly, economic harm by the environment isn't likely to be much of a consideration for these developing nations, considering the fact that the loss that they annually incur from things like the environment is much unlikely to be outweighed by the net loss that they incur by just simply not having things like clean water, just not having jobs on the ground, or not having trains and such. Therefore, on a degree of severity, we think that we are way over in terms of the development. With that said, I'm going to talk about the less important clash in this debate, which is about the environment. And I'm basically going to engage on two subclashes. First, will people actually buy in or not? And then secondly, I'm going to talk about developed world and whether they'll cooperate to fixing developing nations' problems. First, will people buy in or not? And this is their first and major argument, so disproving this point strategically advances us in this debate. Props analysis here is that information will be more accessible to people on the ground. 3 responses. First, they never prove why accessibility actually leads to buy-in, insofar as they never analyze why those stakeholders calculate changes and opting into these movements. But secondly, why is it that social movements that close in the distance between these people and these environmental issues cannot exist symmetrically on our side of the house as well, right? They do not engage this at all. But third, let's actually analyze who the kinds of stakeholders they're talking about is. Because they make a concession in their Prop 1 that the Western people are aware of the environmental problems that exist on the ground. And then they say, to have a delta in this debate, that their delta mainly lies upon people who don't have an interest in developed nations, or developing nations people who are just struggling to find food on the table and such. Then, the premise for their argument is that these people will suddenly get a lot more interest in development on their side of the house. There's 2 reasons as to why this is unlikely on each of their examples. Firstly, on developing nations people, they just suffer from lack of food or meeting their primary interests. Therefore, it's unclear to me as to why they'll suddenly have so much more interest in things like the environment and take up that extra attention capital. But secondly, about people who don't have interest within things like developed nations. For these people, they already have a certain level of exposure to things like social movements that currently advocate and stress the urgency of the situation on the ground. However, these people are not opting into these social movements despite all of this. Therefore, it's unclear to me why their calculus changes on their side of the house. Actually, fourthly though, let me actually flip their analysis, that these people are actually far more likely to be alienated by the nature of NPVs being radical. Why is my flip analysis likely to be more probable? This extends onto what my previous speakers told you about. But NPVs, notably, is a framework created by scientists, and therefore they want to create urgency. This is why 6 out of 9 boundaries are currently crossed, and it takes a lot of action to actually reverse that. Therefore, the implication of all of this is that per their stakeholders being ignorant in terms of the environment, it's very likely that the natural reaction of them is that they just cannot see what the extent of their action will do to actually change the situation. Therefore, this collective action problem that they want to stress on actually doesn't happen on their side and actually worsens on their side of the house. Briefly then, let's talk about developed world cooperating to fix developing nations' issues. First, it's unclear to me why they'll suddenly become so altruistic. Secondly, the reason why they'll unlikely be altruistic is because they are the ones that are currently emitting a lot in the status quo. They are the ones that precisely need these green technology to actually reduce the amount of emission. Things like China, they are really red in terms of the 9 planetary boundaries right now. Therefore, it's very likely that their priority, before investing into these developing nations, is investing onto the developed nations themselves. Therefore, it's unclear to me why their calculus changes on their side of the house. For all of those reasons, we take the debate, vote Japan.
3 seconds, an innocent human dies of starvation. In a world like that, how does it make sense to ignore these individuals and prioritize the environment for which the impacts are unclear? I'm going to be doing 3 things in my speech. Firstly, on clarification, then I'm going to be getting into 2 classes. First on environment, second on development. Regarding clarifications, I want to clarify firstly what exactly the 9 planetary boundaries actually entails, what it looks like. And what they'll have you believe is that this is an objective metric developed by scientists. And we gave you 2 responses as to this is likely untrue. Firstly, we told you that the 9 planetary boundaries directly only caters to the environment and ignores humanitarian aspects. And then secondly, we told you that humans likely can evolve and develop technologies to counteract the 9 planetary boundaries. On our side, we tell you that 9 planetary boundaries looks like dystopian boundaries and ones that require large-scale environmental change from the globe. We get no contention here. Second piece of clarification. Is it bad that we defend the status quo in our world? And the simple answer is no. We have the fiat to claim this without the use of the 9 planetary boundaries. It's the likely world, and the status quo is, and the important note about the status quo that they miss is that there is a lack of implementation and adoption of the 9 planetary boundaries, contrary to what they claim. But with that out of the way, firstly regarding the environment, they give you 4 main things. Firstly, they tell you it's more understandable and accessible. And this is kind of hilarious, right? Look at one of the CO2 statistics on the non-planetary boundaries. If I tell you the CO2 level is at 400, if I tell you that the CO2 level is at 700 when it should be at 400, what does that mean to you? That doesn't mean anything to most individuals who don't have the capacity to understand it, which is the vast majority of people in the world. So these numbers do not instill any sort of emotional connection which is necessary to drive action. The second thing they tell you, it incentivizes corporations. But the incentives of corporations inherently is going to be on getting money and getting like profit, which means that in their world where there is a significant lack of developmental aid, this cannot stand. But thirdly, they tell you cooperation between countries. And we tell you first that this is unlikely considering incentives, but also second that the impacts of developing countries adopting more environmentally friendly policies is minimal, taking their analysis on how little emissions they have. And fourth and finally, in their POI, they tell you, the environment has effects on things like, drug usage or food, whatever, right? And we tell you, firstly, as we already told you, humans have an instinct to survive, but also being able to choose what you want to eat, etc. is contingent on financial capacity. But even if none of our rebuttals stand, take this, that humans have a survival instinct, which means that the bare minimum necessity to sustain life on Earth is still going to be met in either paradigm. On our world, we tell you about more public buy-in, and we tell you that even if accessibility is higher on government, this is taking their best case, that we still are the only side that mechanized an incentive for these individuals to buy into these frameworks and buy into these policies in the policies in the first place, which is the premise for any of the impact standard. Moving on to development very quickly then, what they tell you is, it's important that we get these individuals information, and they also try to impact this in a principled way. And we gave you 4 responses here. Firstly, that there exists no restriction on information in the status quo. Secondly, that there's no incentive to read this, like I gave you my anime analogy. And thirdly, there exists no capacity for change from these individuals. And then fourthly, that even in the very worst case scenario for our world, we're willing to take the trade-off of individuals in developing countries not understanding anything about the environment, insofar as we are the only side that protects the lives of these individuals, which comes a priori. The way here is very, very simple. We told you that equality of lives of citizens on the ground in developing countries significantly is superior and more important to environmental protections for 4 reasons. Firstly, on the intensity of the impact, secondly, on the time frame of the impact, and then we gave you 2 other metrics on the principle on how this ought to be protected, and then also how being alive literally is the prerequisite for enjoying the impacts of environmental protection. Panel, why should individuals starving on the brink of death have to care about the environment when it's really not even their fault? For all these reasons, incredibly proud to oppose. Thank you.
I will begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, why should starving individuals care when they have all of these issues going on about climate change? I'll tell you a story about my weekend, right, and how it very directly relates to this debate. I spent the last weekend in Narok County, Kenya, where students only have half a bucket of water to last them the week. Why is this the case? It is the case because of the extended drought seasons that Kenya has been going through, directly because of the issues that exist within the climate change issues that are outlined in the boundaries, and because people are not taking drastic actions to solve these, so that there can be more rain in Narok County, so that people can actually have access to the water. This is why people care, because the issues that are underlying this starvation are directly related to the solutions brought forth by the 9 planetary boundary solution. What they fail to understand, and why they lose this debate, is that they have an issue with the problem being harsh and the requirement for effective solutions to be harsh as well. The reason that the 9 planetary boundaries is harsh at our absolute worst case, like you claim, is because it is realistic, because it actually tells us how far we've exceeded our carbon emissions. And at the point where you settle for something that gives a soft presentation and see why it's better to have soft people-pleasing policies, then you actually don't get to the root of the issues and therefore fail to create substantial change. And there are 3 main clashes that I'm going to analyze this on. Firstly, on the layer of effective remedy. One thing that they fail to engage with is its actual use in status quo, not the way that they've strawmanned it. It is used in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. The implementation of the SDGs isn't as dystopian as they claim. And at the point of engaging with this, the response is to say, no, this can't be the 9 planetary boundaries framework because it's nice and exclusive of development. But it's literally a fact. It's not something that they can dispute. So the fact where they're sidelining reality, simply because it doesn't align with what their case says, just says that they're very ill-prepared. But even secondly, in its use in activism, we actually mechanize this in our speech to talked about how leaders of movements give information. In our first speech, I talked about how Greta Thunberg pushed this narrative that we only have 30 years to reverse climate change. We only have 30 years to stop giving the damage of single-use plastics. And the awareness created from that wasn't from people individually going to read the 9 planetary boundaries framework, but relying on the work that the leader of this movement did. And I characterized how that will be used in similar movements going forward, the same kind of information, because of the urgency they create with the way that we mechanize it. But even second, on the issue of effective remedy, at the point where they say that the biggest problem with the implementation of the policies created by the 9 planetary boundaries is that they're going to be excessively harsh, we redress this in 2 ways. Firstly, is that it just doesn't engage with how they're being used in status quo. They're not as unpopular. The UN Sustainable Development Goals are not unpopular. The Paris Agreement also was used in the 9 planetary boundaries framework, and is very, it doesn't correlate to what they're saying. But even secondly, at our absolute worst case, where we have the most dystopian policies, where we don't allow anyone to do anything that harms the environment, note that we actually deal with the problem as urgent as it actually is. And where there's an urgent presentation, then as our second speaker said, it will encourage radical solutions. And this leads now to the clash of development. The first thing the main thing that they talked about is that it's unfair to the global south because it does not leave room for development. What our second speaker replied to, and what they don't gauge, is that at the point where these issues are so big within their countries, then it's in the interest of their long-term sustainability to actually solve these issues. And even secondly, they said, at the point where they have to develop, then it will be better for them in the long term to develop sustainably than to actively continue cutting down the forest that animals in Kenya depend on to actually feed the agriculture that our country depends on. We need radical solutions to be able to solve this and for developing countries to develop sustainably. But even thirdly, on buy-in, we tell you that it's more urgent, and we actually mechanize how leaders will use that information to get people to buy in. We tell people that it's urgent, and with that being said, never been proud of it.
We thank all debaters for a very heated, also spirited round.